With us today is Mark Brunson. He's a professor emeritus with Utah State University, and he's going to be talking about how are the region's wetland managers adapting to climate change and drought. Take it away, Mark.
Well, thanks. So yeah, everybody's hearing me, right? In the back? Great, excellent. So yes, Aaron introduced me as professor emeritus, but I'm still doing some research, and so I wanted to actually share some results of things that I've done, we've completed really recently. But I also don't intend to take 25 minutes of sharing information and then just have time for questions. So I'm hoping we get a chance to have a little bit of discussion at the end. So as I said, this is about how the region's wetland managers are adapting to climate change and drought. And I'm applying region a lot broader than I think a lot of the talks at this conference, because we're really looking at the entire Intermountain West. But this is an issue that's of particular importance here in the Great Salt Lake Basin. And so I want to thank my co-authors. Some folks may know Joanna Antarwada is a policy person who was part of the Great Salt Lake Strike Force, has been involved in a bunch of things. Karin Kettering is the region's expert on Phragmites and Phragmites control. And so we basically are very interested in how wetland management can adapt to changes that they're facing. So if we start, we think about, there's a bunch of things that make wetland management more difficult. Stressors that are affecting, is drought and climate change. There's invasive plants and animals like the Phragmites. There's rapid expansion of human population in our region in particular, but across the Intermountain West, there's certain places like that. There's changes in water and soil chemistry that we're seeing that's associated with other kinds of global change processes. And so there's a lot of different things that can make it more difficult to manage wetlands. And so our lab, the Wetland Restoration Lab at Utah State a couple of years ago, we're like, well, we need to understand what the managers are thinking so that we can really identify the kinds of tools and practices that will help them most. So we did a survey in 2022, and it was mostly focused on restoration questions. But one of the questions we asked was, what are the concerns? What are the stressors? What are the things that concern you most? And so, and at the time, well, what did we find? Well, this was published earlier this year in a paper led by Annie Henry, one of her postdocs. So basically, drought and climate change came in first, followed by invasive plants, which for this lab is important, water, timing, and delivery. But at the time, I was also the Utah person on the National Climate Assessment. So this is a 5-year, every 4 years, the government expects a bunch of people to figure out what's the state of how climate change is affecting the United States. This is by law. And so I was basically focusing on Utah. And so I was really interested in this question about drought and climate change. And my question became, all right, I know that managers are trying to cope with this. They're not just sitting there throwing up their hands. We need to know what people are doing so that we can be able to try and help them do it in our role as university faculty. And so we created a survey, and the survey was conducted this summer. It took a little bit longer than we wanted to get it going. And so unfortunately, when you do this, try and reach land managers in the summer, you don't get as much attention because they're busy managing. But we were stuck with what we had to do with the way the funding worked. As you could see, the region was pretty large. It was the exact same region as our original survey. So we felt like that would be a really useful way to think about it. We ended up with an updated list of 302 different federal and state managers. And we stuck with them largely because they tend to have larger properties and they're easier to find. There's lots of little wetlands. I manage an 11-acre wetland in Cache Valley. No one knows I do that. So and so we ended up with 47 completed surveys, which was 16% of our entire group, but it was still a pretty good set of people. It was roughly, it's about 10 fewer than we got for our original survey. So we feel pretty good about the distribution. We heard from all 10 states that we're in here, with Idaho and Utah being the most likely to respond. It was a little more federal than state. The people who responded were people who do have on the ground as well as administrative responsibilities. So, you know, they know what's going on. They're going to give us good answers. They tend to be experienced. And they're working in a really wide range of wetland systems, from people who are mostly just managing riparian areas to people who are managing Great Salt Lake types of wetlands. So what did we learn? Well, the first thing we wanted to know was what kinds of changes are you observing? What's affecting your ability to do this work? And so, you know, we're not going to be surprised by any of this. More frequent droughts was way up there. Warmer, less water available on average, but you also had some extreme weather events. So you had some times when there was a lot of water, and then some other times when there was hardly any. Water availability, timing was changing, and some new invasive species. So these are the kinds of things that they need to be able to address. All right, so what have they, we asked them next, so what are you doing so far? And what we hear is that about 70%, a little less than 70%, said they are already making some sorts of changes. And I've been doing this kind of question working with land managers for 15 years. And it used to be people say, well, I know the climate is changing. I have no idea what to do. And my agency isn't really giving me any instructions on what I should do, so I'm not doing anything. I'm just sort of hoping that it goes away. And it's not. But now we're getting to a place where, you know, 70% are already doing something, another 11% are planning some, you know, making some, already in the planning stages for how they're going to respond. So what are they doing? Well, the first thing that, you know, the topic, they've changed their management goals to, you know, sort of adjusting their management goals a bit to figure out, to fit what they believe is the new regime, but they're also looking for more water, which I think is really interesting based on what we heard this morning, you know, where the last thing that, you know, they're really kind of hoping that people are asking for less water, you know, and yet people are trying to find new sources to maintain the water they've had. You know, they're adding some new ways to protect wildlife, changing the locations and types of activities. And then, you know, about a third of them are constructing new impoundments, which also is interesting given that we were hearing that perhaps wetlands are seen as a water use that we should have to reduce. So, and then for us, you know, it was important also to know that 82% have increased their invasive species management, so they're adjusting in that way, which means a reallocation of resources to put more into things like that, and changing their revegetation efforts. So looking for the kinds of things that the Kettering Lab produces. If they're not able to do so, why not? And so this is something that happens typically when I answer these questions. So as a researcher, as a scientist, I'm like, I want to develop new knowledge that will help you do your job. But when we look at why people aren't able to do the things they want to do, knowledge is way down there in terms of importance. So these numbers, basically on a 1 to 5 scale, where 5 is most important and 1 is not at all important, you know, what's the big thing is operational challenges. Personnel and budget constraints are really big things going on. The inability to secure the water they need in order to be able to do the things they want. Then the next set of things are more sort of social and political barriers that get in the way. You know, my agency doesn't put a high priority on this, depending on whether you work for an agency that's focused on water or not. We've got interested parties who are disagreeing. So these are the kinds of challenges that people are facing. What do they think is going to happen in the future? Well, pretty much what's happening now, only more of it. You know, more invasive plants and more frequent extreme events was the most common thing that people said, yes, I expect this to happen. More frequent droughts, higher temperatures, changes in the dominant plant species, which is going to affect water use and you know, water uptake. You know, increases in salinity, less so. These last things were really not that important. Didn't expect a whole lot of new natives. We're expecting new invasives. a kind of a pessimistic outlook. And what do they think they're going to be able to do? They're going to continue to increase their revegetation efforts. They're going to, and invasive species treatments. Again, continue to think, well, maybe we can't achieve the same things with this landscape as we used to. So we're going to change adjust our goals to match the new reality. Move some activities. Maybe we'll have to restrict human use over here because it's more important now, because there's, as nesting habitat or something like that. So there's a variety of different kinds of responses that people are looking at. But again, continue to look for more water is going to be part of that as well. And so with that, like I said, I really didn't want to spend the whole time just telling you the results of the survey, because it's fatiguing right after lunch to watch a bunch of these things go by. But I have this audience of people who care about water. So I've put some questions for you. Well, first of this being, and I'm particularly interested in people saying, well, you missed something, or this is not how I'm seeing what I'm seeing in my world. But just basically, the first question is, do these factors match your own expectations? Any thoughts about that from anybody? And we've got a couple of microphones to wander through here. Yeah.
Kind of like multifaceted, but to begin with invasive species, in my experience with management of that, especially with Phragmites, it's extremely intensive, not only in personnel, but also technology, because it comes back year after year after year. And so it has to be a long-term project. And so because of that, I can definitely see the personnel and also the economic constraints. Currently, I work in water rights as well. And so I can understand why people are trying to obtain more water rights. But in a state like Utah, I feel like there's a little left as far as actual reassigning, especially in the Salt Lake Valley. We're basically at capacity as far as assigning water rights. And so I feel like there needs to be more assessment on how the water can be used more effectively rather than diverting, more about the depletion rates.
And I appreciate that. One of the things I should have mentioned, but I didn't, is the second phase of our research, that's led by Joanna Enterwada and Lisa Welsh, is going to focus on more closely on what kinds of policy and management decisions. One of the things that we're really interested in is not so much rights, but transfers, so trades and kinds of things like that, where maybe you can't acquire a new right, but you can acquire water in some agreement with some other partner. And I really wish that we had asked that specific question. But thank you, that's helpful. And you're right about the Phragmites thing is definitely one of the challenges, because it's personnel intensive, it's money intensive. You can't just do it once and think it's taken care of. But it's an increasingly great need.
Yeah, just a question. If you could go back just a couple slides to the bar graph of what's holding them back.
Sure.
And I'm kind of curious that our experience is that there's a lot of fear among wetland managers, especially on the federal level now, especially the last 10 days, this little thing happened. And I'm just wondering, if that first one might be personnel constraints, if that is like I'm managing a wetland, but I'm in a political environment that this is sort of a dirty business. And I'm just wondering if your survey got into that. Managing wetlands in some circles in the American West is like, something you have to keep quiet in some political circles, right? So I'm just wondering if your thoughts about that. It's kind of scary to be a federal wetland manager right now.
Yes. It's kind of scary to be a federal anything right now. But I think, yes. My experience doing these kinds of studies in various settings, I haven't done it in wetlands before, but I've done it in other settings, yeah, they're afraid that personnel will not be as available, and that's going to make it a bigger challenge. Or funding is not going to be available. When we have a, someone who says we cut 2/3 of the federal budget, but we're going to maintain entitlement programs, it's hard to imagine how that's not going to involve reducing the staffs of land management agencies. And the states, maybe, if by any chance what the president-elect's idea that there would just be this huge boom to the economy, maybe the states will have all kinds of money freed up, and they'll be able to spend more money on things like wetland management or protecting the Great Salt Lake. I mean, maybe we should listen, if we're listening to Brenda and talking about hope, maybe that's a place to think. But honestly, yes, the constraints continue. There was a lot of money through the bipartisan infrastructure law for certain kinds of projects, but those, what happens as those dry up, the chances of another one are relatively small. There was a hand right here, yeah.
So I participated in this survey, and it was really interesting to see the results. They track really well with what we're experiencing. But on a note of hope, I want to touch on personnel constraints and budget constraints. So I work for Forestry Fire State Lands, and we manage the bed of the lake, tons of wetlands. And we have not had historically much support, budget and personnel-wise. But because of the raised awareness over Great Salt Lake this past year, we got our budget doubled, and we got 2 new employees for managing the lake bed.
All right, yes. And I think, yeah, I mean, the fact that we have a Great Salt Lake Commission and commissioners, and we have, people care about this, there's, but, and so, yeah, we would hope that there would be more, although I have heard that that for the next session, we should not expect any new legislation. That they feel like they've already done what they need to do, and let's wait and see whether it works before we do anything else. But does that mean that more money could go to that? I also heard they want to reduce funding to universities by like 10%. I think that's something like that. It was in the Salt Lake Tribune this morning, so maybe some of that money could go to the lake. Now that I'm retired from the university. Other thoughts? I have a second question, too. Are there things you need to know? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. You go ahead if you want.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I was just curious about your study in terms of whether you were able to understand where the information that, the interpretations were coming from. Was it empirical data? Was it more perceptions from the wetland managers? Were you able to understand how much they were actually tracking some of these things that led to their understanding of their challenges?
We did not ask specifically where they were getting their information. However, we did ask this question. So this segued really well, thanks. We did ask this question, and what we were interested in, was, just basically, and you could write in anything you wanted. And the kinds of answers we got tended to be, well, it was, for, as I mentioned, Karen and I are plant people more than water people. And so we were really, wanting more information about it. What people wanted was better scientific information, better monitoring, better water balance models and things like that. The kinds of things that, if you heard, Laura Vernon, for example, talking about before lunch, the kinds of information that we need. So I think people are hungry for that kind of information to the extent that they can get it but what they can see is, let's take, okay, 2 years ago I could, or 5 years ago, I would be able to shut off water into this basin and move it over here in August. Now I have to do it in July. And so there's a lot of that kind of information that people notice that they're able to say, are they, is it quantifiable in a way where we could say, this is how much water we've lost in this particular wetland? That may be a little harder to get. But are there things that folks wish that they had in order to be able to do a better job of protecting wetlands while meeting the other water demands that we've got, which are huge? If not, I have one more question, but go ahead. Yeah.
I have one that's current with Salt Lake City's M1A ordinance,
Mhm.
and that is an ordinance in North Point. And the issue is financially beneficial activities that developers would be allowed to pursue in the buffer areas. So piece of information, since I can think of nothing other than bird houses that would be ecologically beneficial and environmentally friendly in these buffer areas, it would be interesting to identify, I think, things that could happen in buffer areas without being harmful to the ecosystem.
You know, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to this, but is any of the money from the Inland Port Commission going to study the impacts of the port? Or is it all about, I mean, the impacts to the terrestrial and aquatic environment as opposed to the air quality environment? I have no idea whether they're funding any of that. Not. Yeah, because that certainly would be a question. You know, what are the impacts of this? You know, what we hear a lot about is about air quality impacts associated with all this additional truck traffic and whatever else. And there are some things going to try and mitigate that, but those aren't the only impacts. And I almost never hear anything about any other impact. So that's a really good question. And I do have one more question up here, so you could just pick any of these or ask me a question about my research and that'll be fine.
Well, this is about scientific information, and it sounded to me like invasive species was huge. And, you know, is there more scientific information that can be generated to help deal with them or find an economic benefit for them, harvest them or whatever?
Right, finding a use for Phragmites. I've thought about that one. Honestly, one of the things that the Kettering Carnes lab is doing right now is looking at new ways to, basically when you know, as was mentioned before, when you take out Phragmites, it comes back, and that's why you have to keep coming back and doing it. Part of why you have to keep coming back and doing it over and over again, at least partly, is because you know, nothing else is getting reestablished there. And so some of the work, and you know, you've been involved in this, but you know, where we're looking at, all right, would seeding work differently? What different kinds of practices might be useful for being able to get ahead of the invasive species problem? And I'm hearing about some good ideas. I spent some time, what was it, the end of September? We were down at Farmington Bay and looking at demonstrations and hearing from some of the graduate students who are doing cool work to try and figure out ways to, I guess, increase the resilience to these kinds of disturbances that come with invasive species. But it is a big challenge, and there aren't probably enough labs working on it. There was another hand up over here.
On a much smaller scale, I did want to highlight the Tracy Aviary Nature Center at Pia Oakway did a Phragmites paper making workshop. And so they were working to utilize the Phragmites in a class setting to make paper. So try that out.
Yeah, you know, I work a lot in rangelands, in West Desert rangelands, and there was somebody has figured out how to make beer with cheatgrass seeds. And so I'm wondering whether Phragmites seeds would work as well. There were hands around here somewhere.
Is there any effort across the watershed to incentivize legacy families to donate their property as a way to preserve wetlands and associated properties?
Is there, I wouldn't say there's there is a state program, the Lee Ray McAllister Fund. It doesn't have very much money in it. I now work my primary job now is with the Nature Conservancy. And so I'm happy to say, yes, there is an organization that is very, very interested in that sort of thing as part of, from a sort of land trust and develop, contribution of rights kind of thing. And the ranch where I work part-time is an example of that, but it's not in the Great Salt Lake watershed. But I think that is going to be part of the challenge, I think. And I think that's a place where the nonprofit sector can be really important. We have land conservancies, Bear River Land Conservancy up in my part of the state, that are working on those kinds of issues. I think, as the question that we had before about when there is a administration that doesn't place as much value on environmental conservation, the private sector tends to become more important, and particularly the non-government sector. There's one over here. Rose has a question, and somebody else does. Yeah.
I have one.
Yeah.
Sorry, and it's a two-part question. So with Phragmites, we often hear that it's bad and then the negative things. What good does Phragmites cause, number one? And number two, are there other invasive species other than Phragmites that seem to be going off? And could the extent of the Phragmite, okay, so three parts, sorry. Could the extent of the invasive species be telling in the effects that the area is suffering from climate change?
Okay. There was a lot in there. What I can say, one is I have seen marsh wrens nesting in Phragmites, but they would just be just as happy nesting in native bulrushes. I don't know if there's, honestly, Phragmites, because of the sort of monocultures they form and the densities of things, I'm sure there are some species that can cope with them, but on a balance, I would say the Phragmites relative to other species, community types is a detriment. One of the things that I have seen, is if we can expect with climate change, there's a reasonable chance that we'll have more challenges with tamarisk, which again is a species that uses a fair amount of water, it changes water chemistry, it has some challenges associated with it. So this is a concern, depending on the type of wetland, we can also expect to see like annual mustards or other kinds of species that can get into these places. So there's a fair number of invasives that we can be concerned about. I do have to admit that I work with Bear River Land Conservancy, and at one point we wanted to get rid of the Russian olive trees in the riparian zones, but we had this big debate about, do we get rid of it immediately because it's a noxious weed and it's on the state list, or do we leave it because it provides some habitat until we can get something else established? So the decisions that people make about invasive species is not all, and your question really got to that. Sometimes the chief cause of problems is solutions. We think we solve one problem and we create a new one. And invasives is a good place for that. Do we have room for one question?
I'm sorry, that has to be our last one. We're out of time for questions. But okay. This has been a great discussion, and I'm sure people can follow up with you after this. Yes. But thank you, Mark Brunson.